Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to week 11, the last week of the module, American Empire. I'm in my office today and I'll be heading out for my walk once again. A little bit, I guess, of a connection to the first walk that I did, which began on campus and then went back down through Selly Oak along the canal. This time I will start on campus and head directly toward the city center. And I thought, just for a little bit of symbolism, I'll begin with two big symbols, one that I've highlighted before, of imperialism here in Birmingham, the Old Joe Clock Tower, named for Joseph Chamberlain. And today I'll see if I can make it from the Old Joe Clock Tower to Chamberlain Square, which is now open. If you have been away from campus, you haven't probably had a chance to see it yet. So let's go and have a look at that. And I'll be talking about very contemporary history this time, history of the U.S. empire in the 21st century, looking at, in three parts, initially the George W. Bush administration, turning then to a few comments about, I think I'm calling it Money and Migration, a section on thinking about wealth and growing wealth inequality and migration into the United States and globally. And then finally, some remarks on very recent history, thinking about the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. So let me get outside. I'll start with a view of the Old Joe Clock Tower and make my way towards Chamberlain Square. More in a minute. Okay, hi. Outside here, just behind the Arts Building. And there it is, Old Joe. It's quite a nice evening. Let's get the sun in there. So let me head, I guess I'll go this way, behind the Arts Building and make my way towards the canal, towards the Vale, and I'll turn off and go along the canal towards the city center. Okay, so George W. Bush. After two terms of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush took office after winning the election of 2000, which was a very contested election. It quickly became clear that Florida was the kind of central state in contention, and there were issues of, unlike the election of 2020, there were actual issues of technology, not necessarily voter fraud, but issues around whose votes were being counted and whose votes were being written out in the count. And so the basic point here is that in this election between George W. Bush and the Democratic candidate, Al Gore, there were questions about the legitimacy, the amount of votes that Bush got, and Gore had won the popular vote, so this was also an important issue. It ended up coming down to the Supreme Court, who ultimately decided in Bush's favor, and of course, Bush came into office. So the Bush administration began with, crisis of legitimacy is probably too strong a term, because the Supreme Court put its official stamp, so this was legal, and the Bush team was in. But it did raise some questions, and definitely the Bush inauguration was one that had protests at it, as well as people out to see the new president and celebrate the Republican victory. So there was a bit of, a commission was set up to look into irregularities in the voting, and definitely there was a racial dimension to this. African-American voters were much more likely to have their votes not counted in the Florida count. So there were also systemic questions, systemic issues that raised questions about this election. So Bush begins office coming in, again, with legitimacy, but also legitimacy not, I guess, accepted and shared by everyone. The Bush administration, in any case, got underway, and this gave power to a new group of hardline conservatives, sort of Bush's circle, who, first of all, I want to emphasize, continued the neoliberal kind of policy emphasis that I talked about before of the Clinton administration, really important continuities from Clinton to Bush in terms of economic policy, but also a more kind of aggressive foreign policy and a more moralistic sort of approach to foreign policy, to domestic and foreign policy, and bringing sort of more overtly conservative values to a shared neoliberal kind of governance shared with the Democrats in terms of overall approach. Okay, so Bush comes in, and he's got Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. Probably the most moderate figure in his among his group of advisors was Colin Powell, the military figure and Secretary of State for Bush. So a significant number of prominent Bush appointees, including Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz, were affiliated with what was called the Project for a New American Century. And I've got a slide up about that so you can have a bit of a look at their kind of policy orientation. The PNAC called for increased defense spending, not surprisingly, with the goal of complete international military dominance, as well as the continuation and protection of capitalist neoliberal globalization, again, as we've seen with Clinton before. Okay, so, I mean, in fact, it's not as though the U.S. lacked for military muscle here at the beginning of the 21st century, because there actually had been a spending uptick under the Clinton, in the late years of the Clinton administration as well. So the military was already kind of, I mean, the U.S. military would be in a strong position anyways, but it's not like it was that the Bush group came in as U.S. military spending was declining or something. The opposite, in fact. So this presented a bit of a problem because, of course, the PNAC agenda was going to be expensive, and so there were questions, discussions around how to convince the U.S. public of the necessity for the kind of more than robust, very expensive, that's the main point, very expensive kind of budgetary agenda here for military spending. So this was a problem for the PNAC, who again, were very influential in the Bush administration. Now, the PNAC did make reference to a kind of catastrophic or catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, something that could galvanize the population in the United States around the PNAC agenda, which very much included the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq as part of its foreign policy goals. So this new Pearl Harbor did arrive when 4 commercial jet airlines were hijacked by 19 members of the militantly Islamist group Al-Qaeda on the morning, of course, of September 11th, 2001. So one of the planes, as I'm sure you know, crashed into the Pentagon, 2 others into the World Trade Center, and the 4th one was brought down by the passengers in a field in Pennsylvania. The 2,976 victims were killed, and of course the 19 hijackers were killed as well. And they were from Saudi Arabia. Most were from Saudi Arabia. 15 from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, and 1 each from Egypt and Lebanon. So these attacks were possible in part because of failures to coordinate intelligence among the different intelligence gathering agencies of the U.S. government, the FBI, CIA, Defense Department, National Security Council. So this was one problem. And at the time, top officials were more focused on the threat of Iraq, the threat that Iraq might pose to the United States. So afterwards, there was this kind of discourse that everything had changed as a result of 9/11. It's a discourse that some people disputed, but it was quite dominant in that moment, that this was a unique moment in world history, unlike any other. So the Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, issued a letter, what he called a letter to America, in 2002. He didn't initially claim responsibility for 9/11, but he did within a couple of years. And his letter, predictably cited, U.S. support for Israel, U.S. support for undemocratic client regimes throughout the Middle East, what bin Laden called the theft of the Middle East's oil wealth, and the sanctions against Iraq. He cited all of these things as sort of reasons for his and his group's opposition to the United States. Okay, so President Bush did not engage with these points, either to refute them or to point out that they obviously, even if they were true, in no way justified the attacks of September 11th. But he didn't engage with the points in that way. He didn't engage with them at all, in fact. He instead spoke about a monumental struggle of good versus evil. The First Lady, Laura Bush, also was talking about the fight against terrorism being a fight for the rights and dignity of women as well. So there was a kind of feminist discourse that was mobilized at this moment as well, or a version of feminism, which obviously many other feminists contested as well. Now, there's a couple of things about 9/11, a couple of I don't know, they circulate and they're not true. A couple of lies about 9/11 that I just want to make sure that I clear up and have no ambiguity about whatsoever. So first of all, the 9/11 attacks were a devastating assault on the United States, killing thousands of civilians, and whatever truth or untruth there would be to the claims of bin Laden and those who carried out the attacks, obviously they in no way justify the attacks. That's just obvious, but should be said. Secondly, there's also sometimes, I'm sure you've heard this, some kind of version of the idea that 9/11, as it's sometimes called, was an inside job. There's no credible evidence to support this whatsoever. The fact that the PNAC wanted to carry out, a very expensive and very full military agenda did not mean that that in any way that there's any evidence that they actually had some connection to or called for 9/11. So 9/11 then, to be clear, again, obvious but needs to be said, was not an inside job. Okay, so the Bush administration did, though, see, sometimes the one general, Peter Shoemaker, for example, the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, pointed to the idea of kind of a silver lining that this devastating attack had occurred, but its ideological impact would be a galvanizing one, and one that would heighten an environment, atmosphere of patriotism in the U.S., which it did. Okay, now those who know campus know that where I am at this corner. It's just a little bit dangerous to cross, as I'm sure everyone who lives in the Vale knows. Cars come speeding down, get to safety, and keep going. Okay, so and they were right. They were right in that a very strongly patriotic kind of atmosphere followed 9/11. Not too surprising that this is the case, and indeed it was.
Good luck, sir.
Thank you. I'm recording a lecture. Nice. Okay, so this this made it easier to pass legislation like the Patriot Act, which made it easier to surveil citizens and decreased the rights to dissent. And there was kind of this patriotic atmosphere that I'm talking about was one in which it became not actually the case, but there was sort of this mood that that equated criticism of government policy, and there are many legitimate criticisms, obviously, of the Bush administration, as there would be of any presidential administration, but it sort of equated that kind of dissent or critique with aid to or support to or being soft on the terrorists. Okay, now I want to get over to the canal here, but it's a very unsafe crossing. Let's see if I can do it. Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, so after the attacks of September 2001, President Bush was in a better position to defend this logic of what was called full spectrum dominance. And again, this is sort of following from the PNAC agenda, that the idea was to be able to meet any and all potential threats to the United States all at once at any given time. Total, full spectrum, total dominance militarily at the global level. Okay, so, and the other part about this that was really significant. Let's see, someone's coming along. Oh, okay. Just a second. Busy? I guess it's so nice out, it's not surprising. Okay, let me just go. Right. So this was full spectrum dominance. So this agenda was more able to be carried out in light of the context of heightened patriotism following 9/11. Secondly, this wasn't just full spectrum dominance vis-a-vis threats to the United States, but also significantly to what the administration deemed potential threats. So it's even a further kind of, we might say, you could say robust, you could say aggressive, depending on which way you kind of want to slant this, but definitely a very full form of dominance to have full spectrum against actual and potential threats. Okay, so in any case, by 2002, the United States was already at war with Afghanistan. So as early as September 12th, 2001, so the very next day, Bush had asked his staff to find any shred of a connection between the terrorist attacks and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, both Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz pushed for an immediate attack against Iraq without waiting for the evidence necessarily. But Colin Powell, again, the more moderate figure in the Bush administration, pushed for a focus on Afghanistan, which the administration initially did take up. So within a month of September 11th, the US invaded Afghanistan with the stated aim of capturing or killing Osama bin Laden and removing the Taliban government who harbored him. Now, you know that the Taliban government was there in the first place as kind of the longer, one of the longer outcomes of the aftermath of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And you'll remember the US support for the Mujahideen, which I talked about before, during the Reagan era. Okay, so the invasion began, and the US forces were unable to find bin Laden, and this remained true for the rest of the Bush administration. So one of Bush's key goals was not achieved in the early or later days, in the years following September 11th. Okay, so before the end of 2001, the U.S. officials were, continuing to look for evidence against Iraq, or look for a kind of link between Iraq and 9/11 somehow, and particularly focusing on the possibility that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction as well. So the invasion was initially in Afghanistan, but the focus initially and then increasingly was on Iraq. In January 2002, in a State of the Union address, George Bush identified what he called an axis of evil. And this was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. So three kind of key enemies identified by the US government, none of whom had anything to do with 9/11, but nonetheless, this was sort of the heightened patriotism following 9/11 enabled the Bush administration to kind of put this agenda forward. Okay. So, again, attention rapidly shifted to Saddam Hussein, who, according to the Bush administration, posed a threat to the United States for a few different reasons. There was a few different kind of potential threats that Iraq supposedly posed. One was its military capabilities, again, as I mentioned before, for chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction. The second was Saddam Hussein's support, alleged support, again, for terrorism, and in particular Al-Qaeda. And third, a kind of third point was often made, that the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and his regime would lead to democratization of the Middle East. So none of these things, of course, were true. This does not mean that Saddam Hussein was a Democrat or a figure that we need to defend in order to see the fact that the Bush administration's case against Saddam Hussein's government was one that was not based on truth. So there was little in the way of credible links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, between Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. But the case was presented in any case. Dick Cheney, for one, contended that there was no doubt that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stated that Iraq would acquire nuclear weapons fairly soon, in her words. The president also stated that the Iraqi regime, in his words, possessed and produces chemical and biological weapons and gave shelter and support to terrorism. So the claims were made repeatedly. This is the key issue. And Congress, including prominent Democrats such as Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, went along with these claims, and in October 2002 gave Bush authority to use U.S. military force against Iraq. So the Bush administration had a lot less success in convincing the United Nations about these claims against Iraq. And this led to some real diplomatic tensions, particularly with, maybe most notably with France. Condoleezza Rice informed a French diplomat that, quote, every good reason not to go to war was irrelevant. So there was a sort of a sense that U.S. allies could join the U.S. in its, to use a word, crusade against Iraq, or they just simply weren't going to be listened to, or their views were not going to be entertained. So Colin Powell, again, I mentioned, was the more moderate figure in the Bush administration, but he actually is the one who ended up making the most convincing kind of presentation about these claims about particularly weapons of mass destruction. He gave a presentation in February of 2003 at the United Nations. He dramatically held up a vial that was meant to, represent anthrax, saying that Saddam Hussein's regime, was manufacturing these in large scale, and so on and so forth. Same claims repeated again. But here, with the more responsible figure of Powell, with others, Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, they were kind of, they had their base of supporters, but for many others, they were seen as sort of far-right ideologues, whereas Powell was more able to win over. I mean, the majority of the world was not won over to these claims, but Powell gave it a kind of veneer of legitimacy that other figures were not able to. Okay, so about 2/3 of the population in the United States, that is very important, in the U.S., not elsewhere, came to believe that Saddam Hussein was somehow involved in the attacks of September 11th. Now, neither Colin Powell nor the U.S. government would have been able to have carried this out as this kind of campaign of misinformation as fully as they might have without also considerable support from the media. So it's also true that, and across quite a range of opinion, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, kind of liberal and conservative media, really, for the most part, fell in line with the Bush claims. obviously in the media's case for reasons of, for business reasons as businesses, media businesses, that would be one part of it. Perhaps not wanting to upset advertisers, but also, and related to bottom line concerns, not wanting to appear as unpatriotic in this moment, undoubtedly was an influence as well. Okay, so the war itself began in March of 2003, and in a campaign that was known as Shock and Awe. So this was overwhelming force meant to disorient, demoralize, completely defeat overwhelm the enemy. And this is indeed what happened. The initial code name for the U.S. invasion was Operation Iraqi Liberation. And someone noticed that would give the operation a bit of an unfortunate code name, OIL being the acronym. So they scrapped that and went for Operation Iraqi Freedom in the end. So the invasion took place. Within a few weeks, Baghdad had fallen. Saddam Hussein had fled. The coalition that George W. Bush was able to get together was much less, represented much less cross-section of international participants than George Bush I's coalition against Saddam Hussein back in 1991. And it was a much less impressive with the coalition of the willing, as they called it, with the very important exception of Tony Blair. Tony Blair, as I'm sure you know, very much went along with, and himself was a major promoter of what to call them, the things that turned out not to be true. That might be a diplomatic way of putting it. In terms of the Bush administration's case for its war against Iraq. Okay, so in May of 2003, President Bush landed aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln with a banner that read "Mission Accomplished." So there was kind of a move in terms of the PR dimension of the war to represent it as a pretty quick victory. The war itself was also, but of course this was a very difficult case to make because the connections to Al-Qaeda and 9/11 were never made, the weapons of mass destruction didn't exist, and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein certainly did not lead to stable democratization of the Middle East as a region. Instead, an insurgency gained force against the occupation forces. This is also different than the Gulf War, than the first Gulf War, because this time the troops stayed in an occupation as opposed to what happened in 1991. Okay, so, and again, also, it's important to note that there was a lot of dissent and protest against this war, not least in this country. Tony Blair was a big supporter of George W. Bush's claims, but many among the British people were not. Okay, it's crowded here. Let me just maneuver a little bit. Excuse me. Thanks. Lots of people out for a walk on this nice evening. Okay, so September 11th, again, focused the world's attention on the United States in a very intense way. Everybody was paying attention to this, and of course its aftermath got a lot of attention as well as it ought to have, both from those who supported the claims made by the Bush administration and those who did not. Okay, but another event, now I want to turn to something within the United States, just briefly comment on something also hugely important though. An event within the United States also galvanized the world's attention on the US after 9/11 during the Bush administration. And this was the Bush administration's response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans. So the storm, the predictable storm, made landfall on August 29th, 2005, and hit the city, of which about 2/3 of New Orleans were African American at the time, and the devastation was huge. Levees broke, as had also been predicted. Again, because of course meteorologists were able to note the storm coming, in the days leading up to it, and there were definitely calls for people to get out of town ahead of the storm. And I mean, one way of thinking about it is those who had cars and access to cars left town, and those who did not were left behind. There was flooding, there was massive damage across the city, particularly with the rupture of the levees, and over 1,500 people were killed. Over 1,500 people were killed. Okay, now the neoliberal context matters here too. Again, I've said before, this is neoliberalism being an economic individualist kind of mode of organizing the economy, and of course in a racially stratified society like the United States has major racial implications as well, and this was very much the case in New Orleans. Before Hurricane Katrina, under the Clinton administration, the 1996 welfare legislation, which I mentioned before, had a devastating impact on further impoverishing the already vulnerable within the city. And so let me see here, I have a statistic. 85% of those living in New Orleans, living in poverty in New Orleans, were African American. And Louisiana also had a very high rate of incarceration, which of course is not racially neutral either. So there's a number of ways in which we can think about New Orleans as devastated by the storm, but also ways that we can think about New Orleans as already devastated by neoliberalism before 2005. In any case, after the storm, the state's response, the federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, was not able to, basic competence was not on display. People gathered at the sports arena, at the Superdome, and were just essentially left to fend for themselves. It was to many observers an appalling level of incompetence, or perhaps even indifference. And of course, the fact that these were, almost entirely African Americans who were left behind in this way, just demonstrated to any observers the clear racial dimension of what was taking place. Okay, and mass incarceration also impacted the situation in that people who were incarcerated within New Orleans were also at times left in their cells while the floodwaters came in and rose. I mean, people who survived that, it's hard to imagine how terrifying that must have been. So there are a variety of ways in which the kind of state reordering under racial neoliberalism that I've talked about before were very much in evidence in New Orleans before the storm, during the storm, and indeed in the response or lack thereof afterwards. So at national and kind of international levels, and another connection to Iraq is that the Louisiana National Guard, 40% of them were in Iraq, so they weren't available to assist in this crisis either. And so at the national, and maybe even more so at the international level, the Bush administration's lack of response to Hurricane Katrina really called into question these kinds of claims that the United States was the best power under the Bush administration to bring democracy and good government to the Middle East. So the different sort of national, domestic and international kind of dimensions of this connected in different ways. Okay, so that's some stuff about the Bush administration. I think I've gone on for a bit long about that, but there's quite a bit to say, of course. This is so important. The U.S. war against Iraq in 2003, sets the terms for our own times in many ways, and all of its many repercussions. So let me pause for a second, and then I'll say a bit about money and migration and move on from there. Okay, more in a moment. Okay, back again. Let me try and be brief and just make a few points here on this money and migration section. So what I want to talk about here is, in particular, the growing transnational wealth gap that neoliberalism represents at the global level, and also point to the fact that this is happening within the United States as well. And I don't think this is going to come as news to anyone. So let me just say a couple of things about this. So I mean, there's a couple of things to say. Neoliberalism has produced, wealth inequalities. No problem. But it's also produced, of course, tremendous wealth. That's part of its kind of dynamic, right? And we can see this, of course, in the great and growing fortunes of the now very, very rich kind of plutocratic class within the U.S., but also transnationally. And this is something that. This is a complex question when we're thinking about U.S. empire, because this is a transnational class of elites, but also, has particular power concentrations within the United States, and so it renders complex an analysis of U.S. imperialism when it's not simply the case that U.S. elites are dominating elsewhere. I mean, we could see that in Iraq, for example. But if we also think about neoliberal globalization in its now, in the year 2021, or in the 21st century more broadly, it's complicated because there are also some very well-placed non-US elites who are part of the global economy, obviously, as well. So something for us to think about, and I think take up in seminar, this relationship. Is the transnational, I guess a question could be, to what extent does the existence of a transnational elite render maybe unconvincing ideas about U.S. imperialism? So we can think about that and talk about that some more in class. But as it stands globally, now, just a handful of people own 50% of the wealth in the world. The planet in which we live is very unequal, and that has definitely become more the case, and more extremely the case, in recent years. Okay, so and then, of course, within the United States, again, as I've been emphasizing, and rightly so, this is such an important aspect of this, is that there is, of course, a racial component to how the growing wealth divide is deepening and becoming further entrenched within the United States. By different standards, we can measure earnings. For example, the average African American family earns 59 cents to the dollar that whites in the United States make. But a more revealing statistic is how much wealth families possess on different sides of, I guess we could call it the color line here, still in effect when we're thinking about racial and wealth disparities. So for every dollar owned by the average white family, the average African American family owns 10 cents. So this is, of course, because of ways in which the wealth divide is being entrenched in recent history, and obviously, of course, it also builds on longer histories of racial wealth inequality going all the way back as well. Okay, so important to remember the racial dimensions of neoliberalism here as well. Okay, so a couple other points on race and neoliberalism here, and one is, again, mass incarceration. It's one of the key expressions of this, and it's such a potent reminder of the fact that neoliberalism is not simply about the decrease of the state, about the shrinking of the state, but rather a redeployment of state resources in favor of business and in favor of protecting, a certain order. And mass incarceration has been a key part of this, which has been very much a strengthening, an enlargement of the capacities of the state in certain arenas. Okay, so, the United States also has the highest rates of incarceration per population around the world. So another thing to not let slip out of our analysis here. Okay, so and this connects to something else that I've talked about in lecture and that we've talked about in class before, and that's the relationship between direct interests of various businesses and an overall kind of systemic order. And so we can think about the prison system and mass incarceration in both of these ways. It is true that that UNICOR, for example, organizes prison labor for the Department of Defense, for Department of Defense contracts, helmets and other military materials made by imprisoned labor. It's also true that UNICOR contracts out prison labor to many private companies, thereby benefiting them directly. But I think we also, and that's very important to attend to, and I don't want to, write that off as not important. At the same time, I want to call our attention to the way that this works systemically, that in a deindustrializing or deindustrialized, maybe at this point, economy in the United States, in which manufactured goods are made, elsewhere, China, for example, that this is a kind of expression of a system of racial capitalism in terms of organizing the population, that from one kind of logic, surplus workers are warehoused under these conditions. So there's a systemic expression of power that's going on here as well that we want to think about. And as we've been talking about so much in this class, this relationship between, specific interests of various individual or collective well-placed elites and expressions of the structure overall. Okay, so let me say another thing about mass incarceration is that it very much connected to the U.S. war against Iraq, in that many of the personnel involved in the invasion and the occupation were also previous to this employed as guards in the prison industrial complex as well. And this connected through, a series of really significant scandals. Torture was not uncommon in places where Iraqi detainees were being held by U.S. forces, but also there were some particularly public scandals that were really awful, obviously, and they involved U.S. personnel. And they involved torture, sexual humiliation, photographs, just places like Abu Ghraib. And some of the personnel involved in these were also, previous to this, workers in the prison industrial complex, where also forms of dehumanization and brutality were routine. So we also want to think about that connection again between the domestic structures of rule and their projection to other places, in this case, Iraq. Okay, I won't say too much about Walmart, but I did want to just raise that. I put a few slides up about Walmart just to also point out that not all of the projections of U.S. power and U.S. financial interests were solely through kind of military means during the Bush administration. Walmart obviously existed before Bush came into office, and Walmart's international expansion kind of Walmart was an important company begins in Arkansas, and it's an important company within the United States for quite a few years. Sam Walton makes connections to the opportunities for cheap manufactured goods in China in the 1970s, and it's really in the 1990s that Walmart begins, in the moment of NAFTA, really begins its expansion internationally in terms of its stores in countries outside of the United States, beginning with Canada, again, not coincidental to the NAFTA arrangements beginning in 1994. So I just wanted to point to Walmart here as a kind of, in their language, everyday expression of kind of U.S. influence and power around the world. Okay, so one other point here in this section, and is just to talk about migration, which is a very important issue in the U.S. at the moment, has been going all as far back as I think we could imagine, and here. Again, in the context of neoliberalism, in the context of NAFTA, this has not meant the easy, maneuvering, again, this, of people in Mexico or Latin America to the United States, even though NAFTA has created the conditions in which people will be more likely to want to move, because NAFTA also involved a kind of overwhelming of small business and small agriculture within Mexico. But instead, the response has been, again, as more of a kind of state security, military, border policing type of setup. And this has also involved various kind of legislation. I used Arizona as an example. They had particularly draconian legislation put forward to police and surveil migrants from Latin America. And this was also connected to this is, we can see in some ways the lead up to the Trump years here, because this is also connected to an assault on ethnic studies within universities in Arizona was also part of the situation in Arizona, connected to forms of Latino racism, and connected to kind of white anxieties about the border, and connected to this increased sense that the border needed to be more and more militarized, more and more policed. Okay, but of course, this has not been met without its own series of responses from migrants themselves and their allies in the United States. 2006 was a very good example of this. Over 1 million, maybe 2 million people took to the streets on May Day that year to really dramatize the extremely important role that migrant labor plays in the United States economy. And you can also see, I put up some of the signs there that were part of those events, and you can see that some of the questioning goes well beyond questioning just specific kinds of pieces of legislation, though that was definitely part of it in 2006, but also questions that go to the very fundamentals of issues that we've been talking about in this module. What is the legitimacy of the borders, and who got to draw them, and who, is allowed to call the United States home legally, and so on and so forth. It calls into question the settler foundations, among other kinds of aspects of U.S. society and U.S. history. Okay, so let me, and I guess the other thing is just that immigration has, it continues to be a hugely important issue. There's so much to say about it, and it will continue to be so. I think I'll just close this section here by just sort of emphasizing the importance of this issue, which again I'm sure you already know, but to also really emphasize migrant agency in this situation, in which people have moved to the United States for a variety of reasons, often to try to better their families, and the very difficult situations in which they have found themselves has not led to a silence on the part of migrants or families of multiple generations in the United States as well. Okay, so you can see here I'm at the mailbox. Continues to be a very nice evening. Let me pause for a minute and come back with the third and final part of lecture. Just a moment. Okay, continuing on then. From 2008, in which, of course, the United States experienced an extremely important election. Barack Obama becomes president, first African-American president, born in Hawaii to a Kenyan father and white mother from Kansas. He spent time growing up in Indonesia. He later went to Columbia and Harvard Law Schools. He worked as a community organizer in Chicago before becoming an Illinois state senator, and then a U.S. senator, and then, of course, ultimately the president. So he's elected in November of 2008, sworn in 2009. A hugely important, historic and symbolic moment in U.S. history to have an African-American president, of course. So like previous administrations, going back to the 1980s, the Obama administration was also neoliberal in its ideological and economic orientation. So again, the continuities here from Reagan through George Bush Sr., Clinton in the 90s, George W. Bush, and then Obama are there for us to see. Let me put it that way. So this approach was evident in the Obama administration in healthcare reform, for example. So you know, this is something that the Bush administration was less interested in, and this was a key sort of platform for Obama, wanting to bring in healthcare reform. But this did not seek to change the essentially private nature of healthcare reform. This was not a call for anything, you know, this wasn't a call for an NHS in the United States, for example. So in this sense, neoliberalism, you know, continued to sort of form the kind of economic common sense, I guess we would say, of the various administrations of the late 20th and early 21st century. But importantly, neoliberalism, even though it was never really referred to as that, became kind of an election issue in 2008 because during the campaigning, the economy crashed. And the causes for the 2008 recession had very deep roots. And again, it goes back to the kinds of, you know, it's often called deregulation, but I think it's more precise to call it re-regulation in the kind of terms that I've been talking about, you know, a redeployment of state resources away from social spending and more towards state and state security spending. Nonetheless, I might sometimes call it deregulation because that's the kind of most often the term that's most often used to describe what I'm talking about here. So what I mean by deregulation, by which I really mean re-regulation, or I guess I'll put it more precisely, deregulation happening in a larger context of re-regulation. Deregulation is part of neoliberal re-regulation. Okay, that's probably the best way to put it. So what this, how this connects to 2008 then is a deregulation of the kinds of regulatory environment in which Wall Street was operating. So the Glass-Steagall Act is probably the best example here, going all the way back to 1933, which is meant to be a kind of firewall between different kinds of banks, commercial banks and investment banks, essentially preventing Wall Street from taking people's savings and speculating with them on the kind of casino-style financial market. So this was a law that was meant to, that enforced a kind of divide between different banks and prevented this practice from happening. Okay, so there was a push to get rid of this legislation, and indeed it was removed in 1999 during the Clinton administration. So it's one good example of the kind of neoliberal context in which the 2008 crash unfolded, which was very much Wall Street's crash, the 2008 crash. It was very much the cause of unregulated financial activities on the part of Wall Street, and even Barack Obama very much, you know, agreed that this was a key cause as well. Okay, so Obama comes in after being elected in 2008, but he appoints Timothy Geithner and Lawrence Summers, who were two of the key kind of architects of the push towards deregulation and indeed bailouts of large companies who had behaved irresponsibly, I guess we might say, on the market. Obama appoints these two as key economic advisors very early in his administration, so signaling again a very strong continuity with the neoliberal kind of ethos of other presidential administrations. Okay, there was a big response to this also in what was called Occupy Wall Street. Protesters occupied Zuccotti Park in New York, and with a slogan, "We are the 99%, positioning themselves against the 1% who had too much wealth and indeed too much hold, too much power on the political parties and the political process. So of course, as usual, these kinds of inequalities that I'm talking about were not uncontested, and Occupy Wall Street was a good example of this. The Clinton administration, or I should say, sorry, the Obama administration also represented continuities with the Clinton administration in the appointment of Hillary Clinton as Obama's Secretary of State. But then a difference was the Obama administration's less focus, winding down the occupation of Iraq, and see if I can go this way. See, I'm almost there. Chamberlain Square is just over there. And the increased focus on the war in Afghanistan. So in 2011, the Defense Secretary Leon Panetta formally announced the end of the war in Iraq. Just gonna get across the street here. And important to remember, about 162,000 Iraqis, most of them who were civilians, were killed in that war. And although this is a hugely, significant number, again, as I kind of pointed out before, the devastating impact of the sanctions, this is less than the numbers the number of Iraqi civilians who were killed by U.S.-led and supported sanctions. So another thing important for us to keep in mind. Okay, so the government that Obama left, I mean, obviously the war was George Bush's war, and Barack Obama had voted against it. We should also note that as well. But of course, as president, he was taking over and trying to address the whole, mess basically that it had become, and perhaps we could say was from the beginning. And the U.S. left Nouri al-Maliki in control, but without a particularly stable government there in Iraq. And I think one of the biggest outcomes, of course, of the whole of it was the spread of the war to Syria. Syria also, with its own dynamics and its own civil war going on there. And the emergence out of all of this wreckage of ISIS, and the just sort of horrific brutalities that group has represented. So indeed, the promise of democratization, of stable democracies throughout the region has proved to be very much not true in the aftermath of the George W. Bush years. For the Obama administration, maybe one of the biggest successes, at least symbolically, was that they found and they killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. And he wasn't in Afghanistan, even though he was probably there in 2001. But by the time he was caught up with, 10 years later, he was in Abbottabad, just north of Islamabad, the capital city of Pakistan. And in any case, there was a raid without any permission or even knowledge on the part of the government of Pakistan, whose country this was. So controversial there. Special forces landed, after they had identified where he was. They landed at his compound. U.S. commandos descended from helicopters, and there was a shootout. They killed several people, half a dozen people or so who were there, and a tall, bearded man who was among the dead. They, through facial recognition technology, confirmed who he was. His body was buried at sea, so that there wouldn't be a permanent kind of site in the aftermath. So this was a kind of big kind of symbolic moment in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and and with obviously a connection going back to 9/11. Okay, here I am at Chamberlain Square. So from Old Joe to Chamberlain Square, as promised. Maybe I'll just take a seat over here and finish a couple of last points. Okay, so of course now we're getting into history that that you very much will remember, because after Obama comes, of course, Donald Trump. In the election of 2016, I mean, I'm not going to say too much here. You already know this. It was a period of very, I mean, chaotic policy, to put it one way. But also, I mean, I laugh, but also, obviously, there are very serious negative kind of dimensions to the Trump administration in so many ways. Not least the fanning of the flames of white nationalism and the kind of green light to a more emboldened form of expressions of white supremacy within the United States, overtly and directly. I think is one of the biggest sort of things we might want to point to in terms of the impact of the Trump administration. Trump's administration might be remembered for the lack of response to the pandemic, I mean, what do you call it? Just a complete lack of regard, and obviously a complete lack of any sort of ability to curb the pandemic or deal with it. And I know I'm saying this sitting here in England, where we can say many things about the British government's response as well. So I guess what I would want to say, though, about the Trump administration is that it came from somewhere. You know, many people were surprised at this election. It seemed like, in some ways, an aberrant sort of, departure from regular politics. And in some ways it was, and in other ways it wasn't. We can think about the longer term structures that we've been looking at throughout this module as a way of accounting for how this individual came into office. We can also think about the shorter term, the stuff I've just been talking about, policy justified on mistruths, right? And of course that was a huge characteristic of the Trump administration. It's lack of proximity to the truth, we could maybe say. And again, very much the individualism of neoliberalism here. And one of the things we might say about Donald Trump, again, as we've talked about so many times, the connection between elite individuals and the overall structure, from the point of view of the sustenance of the structure of racial neoliberalism itself, one of Trump's kind of sins against the system, we might say, is that he was too much of an individualist. He didn't govern in the favor of the class. He governed in the favor of himself, his immediate, most loyal sort of people around him, and of which, of course, very much included his family. So this is another kind of dimension here of the individualism of neoliberalism that we might want to think about in relation to the Trump administration. Okay. Another thing during the and in the build up to the election, towards in the later part of the Trump years, we also saw another threat to the kind of to this a threat to the system, I guess we would say, in the form of Bernie Sanders in the primaries. And so Sanders, of course, was more of a kind of socialist collective kind of threat to the elite interests, I guess, within the system. And I put up a picture there for you to see on the slide of Bernie Sanders with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and to think about the connections here between, again, those long traditions of resistance that I've talked about, and thinking about Sanders seeking the Reverend Jackson's counsel as a kind of just important moment. It's also kind of just a great photograph in the campaign. But also to make a connection here to Jack Odell, who we talked about before, because Odell himself was one of Jackson's advisors going back into the 1980s, and so we can think about that long arc of the Black Freedom movement that we've talked about having an impact very much on contemporary politics during the Trump administration, no less. Of course, Joe Biden ended up being the candidate, and so more kind of we might say centrist kind of politics within the Democratic Party ultimately held sway. But it's an interesting moment to think about. If we think about Trump's threat as the kind of excess of individualism, we can also see at the same time that this is contested with a more kind of collective sensibility from the Sanders campaign. Okay, and of course Trump's administration will also be remembered by what happened after the electoral defeat, and that is, of course, the insurrection on January 6th. And I put up a couple of two parallel photographs there on the slides for you to look at, both taken essentially in the same place. One earlier in 2021, one in January 2021, and one in the 1920s. And you can see, again, the kinds of, where some of this came from. And in the picture of the Ku Klux Klan at the Capitol, you can also see those statues that I talked about earlier, the Rescue and Discovery of America, statues put up in the 19th century, which remained outside the east entrance to the Capitol until the 1950s, as great symbols of settler colonialism as well. So we can think about, in those two images, the kind of longer term structures that give us some way of understanding what took place on January 6th and why. Of course, it's also about recent history as well, and the ways in which the mistruths about the election were spread, and also other interests that were at work that may have funded some of the opposition which took place in the very violent form that it did on January 6th. Okay, last couple of comments here. Of course, now we have Joe Biden as president, again, more kind of centrist within the Democrats, as I mentioned. His vice president, Kamala Harris, first African-American vice president, first woman vice president, first Asian-American vice president. So again, another very important individual in terms of symbolism. The Secretary of State, often a key figure for the tenor of foreign policy, in Tony Blinken, a figure who goes back to the Obama administration, also signals a kind of centrist continuity here as well. I mean, maybe the biggest announcement in terms of foreign policy so far is that Joe Biden has announced that the troops will be removed from Afghanistan by September 2021. So the final wind down of the war there in terms of U.S. involvement, at least. And apparently, Vice President Harris played an important role in reaching this decision. But maybe from the point of view of where I'm sort of sitting right now, where we are as a class right now, I think, obviously the pandemic is far from over. And as I sit here right now, the situation in India is devastating. And we might think here, and I put up a map to sort of suggest this, to think about, the Biden administration's hesitancy to waive the vaccine patents says quite a bit about the longer continuities of imperialism, of European and U.S. imperialism in the world. And so it seems like, a depressing and also quite meaningful sort of way of thinking about U.S. empire in the present. Okay, I should leave it there. And one more look around here for those who haven't been to Birmingham for a while. This is what it looks like in the open Chamberlain Square. This, as I said, great symbol of empire. Let's go look at the plaque. So this class has been about U.S. empire, of course, as you know, but it's also had connections, and we've also thought about it in inter-imperial terms. Here we have the memorial to Joseph Chamberlain, elected town councilor, resigned from that office, great public works, etc. Not too much about empire there, but he definitely was a pro-imperial figure. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks for accompanying me on yet another one of these walks. Look very forward to seeing you in class in this last week of the module. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.